Okay, how's everybody doing? Good? Yeah. It is Wednesday just after lunch. It's a good time to look at pictures of roses. So my name's John. I am a senior manager on the connectivity team at Tableau. And so a lot of times when I come to TC19, I end up giving talks about sort of some esoteric like security protocol or something like that, and it's kind of complicated. It's really good for a certain audience, and I kind of wanted to do something a little bit different because I'm thinking about things kind of a little bit differently from a product perspective. And last night, so I was at dinner last night, and someone asked me at the dinner table sort of what makes Tableau special, right? So this is another company, and they're just talking to us, and they're saying, hey, you know, what's going on? Why do we care? Why do we want to work with Tableau? What makes Tableau special? And my answer at the time was that Tableau, unlike a lot of other products, sort of empowers people. It gets people kind of like, they have their own passions around whatever interest that is, right? It gives them the tools to basically kind of explore the interests that they have. And it's the same thing for me, you know, like I work at Tableau. I build Tableau. I've worked at Tableau for 4 years. But at home, I like to use Tableau as well. And there's a big difference between building and using Tableau. There's a difference in perception. So one of the things that I do at home along with my wife and my family is we hybridize roses. There's not many hybridizers in the Pacific Northwest, maybe 2, besides ourselves. And we've been doing it for about the last 4 years. See if I can make slides go. There we go. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the process. I'm going to talk about what that is. I'm not going to get into a lot of technical detail because I've been warned that maybe not everybody wants to know everything there is to know about rose hybridization. Or maybe that's not true. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I use Tableau to analyze a lot of the data. We'll then kind of look at we're going to pivot a little bit then at that point because I'm a senior manager at Tableau, right? And so I'm responsible for delivering the product. And we're going to look at what happens when you file a bug with Tableau or when I filed a bug with Tableau. We're going to kind of take you through that journey of how sort of that the perception difference in between building and using the product. What happens to your passion when you encounter a problem or you're talking to someone or you need a new feature. How does that actually get translated to the actual engineering team? So first, has anyone done some form of hybridization or do you know what it is? Anybody? Okay. Are you willing to share? I'm just curious.
Yeah,
Oh, really? Seriously? Wow. Okay, awesome. Do you work for a company like professionally?
No, not professionally.
Okay. Yeah. So in a very simple way, it is basically combining 2 roses. You take one rose, you take another rose, you put them together, you've got a new type of rose. And in this case, we have sort of a commercial rose, Midnight Blue, which was crossed with a glauca from the Caucasus Mountains. It produced this new type of rose. It may have a number of faults, it may have it may lack disease resistance, it may have some other problems, but that's the basic process. But there's a lot more to it when you start getting into when you start doing it quite a bit more than on like a handful of rose bushes. And we have about 230 roses that we breed with currently. So my wife got us into this, and the whole family into this. We do this, we have a separate test garden from our house, but most of our hybridization occurs in the Seattle area, kind of locally. The whole family helps. She's a landscape architect. She understands a lot of sort of the aesthetics. She's actually looking for something that will work well as a landscape rose. So the flower is not necessarily as important as sort of something that is low maintenance, something that is easy to install, that sort of thing. But we both have sort of our favorites in this as we kind of partnered on this. She's really particular to certain types of roses. I'm particular to other types of roses. And my children also have different interests. Oh, let's see, here we go. So the process is this. You first rip off the beautiful part of the rose, you pull it all off, you take sort of a set of tweezers, go ahead, take off the pollen and collect it. And as you're doing that, because we have a lot of roses and we have to keep track of a lot of data, we have a little mobile app which we go ahead and we record what we're pulling pollen from, right? So usually in the morning, we go out there and we'll collect pollen and we'll insert this into our database. And then later on, we go ahead and we pollinate. We use Q-tips. There's different techniques and things like that, but this is what we do. And we do data entry for that. So we record the crosses pretty carefully. If we lose track of this information, you've really lost a lot of history, and you've lost the ability to kind of understand sort of where your breeding program is taking you. And we also label, like we are obsessive about labeling. We spent a lot of time researching label makers. We have this little kiosk thing to print out labels automatically when things are when we're ready to pollinate, we just print it out in a strip, go out, collect the data. And this is just to make sure that we're never losing track of the identifier for that particular cross. And then later on when the hips develop, we put tea bags on them to make sure that the label doesn't fall off or the hip doesn't fall off and the label gets lost. And our roses, and this is what our yard looks like. We do not have a typical rose garden. It looks terrible. Like, it looks absolutely terrible. And we have all sorts of different roses, all different types. There is very little unifying theme in our garden. And it sits like this for months, right? It just looks weird. But that's also that we're just collecting the stuff. We can keep it all tied together. Later on, we collect the seeds. We use little microtubules. We label those as well. We sterilize them because you don't want to propagate certain types of fungus. And we label them. We do data entry constantly. So right now we use Airtable for our database. We record all of our information in sort of a pseudo-online database. But you can edit it. Fairly straightforward, and it's kind of helps us simplify a lot of the data we need to work with. Plant the seeds over winter. It goes through a process called stratification, which sort of gets the seed ready to germinate. And then they turn into little roses with beautiful labels. Labels are the most important thing. It's so strange. So we do about 700 crosses per year. This year it was about 750. We could probably do more if we didn't enjoy our summer and take vacations. And we've gotten it down to this process where, we have like a routine, in the morning, do this, do that, we can do a fairly mechanical process. Sort of in the wintertime, we're just about to harvest our seeds. We'll probably have about 1,500 seeds that we'll collect from all the different roses. We'll take the hips, cut them open with an X-Acto knife, start processing them, labeling them, so forth. And this is all in a process it's a 5-year program, really, when you think about it. From the moment we make a cross, it'll take about 5 years before that cross potentially becomes useful. That it's something that we'd actually consider patenting or thinking about actually sharing with others. So, because there's so little survival, we abuse the roses look very ugly, but we want them to survive. We want them to survive in the Pacific Northwest. We want them to have the attributes that we're looking for. So, over different years, they'll go through different phases of this. Eventually, in sort of in the third, fourth, and fifth year, they'll be planted in a test garden, and no maintenance, that sort of thing. We go ahead and process them. It's about 3 to 4K data points. So it's not big data, but it's enough data. It's enough to make it interesting. It's enough to kind of require some thought about how we do things. And I am the data scientist for my wife, right? I sit there and I basically produce reports for her that says, okay, this is, these are the different bloom cycles, these are the crosses, I would suggest, given what we know about our previous crosses. There's literature on this, but some of it is kind of anecdotal, and it's kind of hard to sort of tie everything together from the existing literature that's out there. There's not there's no recipe for how to breed a successful rose, because everyone has their own way of doing it, own sort of emphasis on their program. And we definitely do not want to disappoint her. She needs to know what makes sense on a day-to-day basis. So this is one of the key reports that we do is this sort of a crosstab style thing. I like looking at all of our breeding stock and sort of looking at sort of the full landscape of the different crosses we've made. This is just part of it. This is why I use sort of the tabloid form. I'm not opposed to actually physically representing the data, because it's something that you can actually take out with you. You can look at it. You can kind of get a sense for, if you look at sort of on the rows, you can see, Sally Holmes, or actually this is a good one, Mutabilis, basically crossed well with a large number of roses. It's a very good seed parent. And you can kind of see the different classes that it crossed well with, and you can kind of develop some patterns, some ideas about what might be successful or what you haven't tried or what might be interesting from a hybridization program. And then you can also go a little bit further. You can start to do some predictive analysis of what would be worth your time, given the fact that we want to take vacations in the summer. We don't want to be spending all of our time doing this. We want to make sure that our time is well used. So we don't want to be spending a lot of time on crosses which are never necessarily resulting in something, unless we really, really want those particular attributes. And so we have this good crosses, bad crosses, which is basically a basic scoring system using a table calc that kind of gives us an idea of, hey, which crosses were successful at hip generation, which ones were resulted in sprouts, and then kind of come up with an overall score. And this just kind of, it's guidance for the process. You still need a human to kind of make the decision. And then the other one is we have the advanced crosses to try, which isn't so advanced as it's mostly about establishing the transitive crosses that might be useful. So if you're not familiar with some of the genetics, one of the key things is the ploidy of a particular rose, the set of chromosomes it has. There's a different probability that certain crosses will be successful versus other crosses, depending upon how many sets of chromosomes it has. And you can potentially predict, even if you haven't necessarily made a cross, you can look at sort of what crossed with what previously. If A crossed with B and B crossed with C, maybe A and C might work just fine. And so that's one of the tools that we look at, and it helps sort of divide the space of our rose population into sort of loose categories. And then the other thing is we look at bloom cycles. So over time, the key thing is different roses bloom at different times of the year. And the Pacific Northwest has a very unique profile for all of these different things. So we have to track the bloom cycles across all of the roses we have in our breeding stock. So what we'll be doing is we'll go ahead and we'll say, listen, I here's a good example. Let's see. I really want to cross glauca with a white licorice. So glauca is the one I showed earlier from the Caucasus Mountains with a light white licorice. You see there, the glauca blooms in June, the white licorice blooms in July. And you have sort of a limited time frame in which that pollen is viable to make that cross. Some people say that you can kind of keep it longer. We haven't quite figured out how to make that work well. So what we do is we kind of sort of towards the end of June, we'll say, oh, you know what, we'll sort of stockpile a little bit more pollen from this rose so that we can save it for July, for the first flowers on our white licorice. That sort of thing. Does that make sense? It's a little bit getting into that sort of essentially what we do with our analysis. And that's sort of what I use Tableau for in my spare time. Everybody here probably has their own interests, their own sort of thing that they might use it for. And it's interesting because when you use Tableau for like a passion project, you know, you still run into some problems. You still run into some issues that don't quite make sense. And you beat your head over it and you're saying, why can't I do this? Why can't I do, you know, what's going on with this particular feature? Even if you work at Tableau, right? And especially if you work at Tableau. Sometimes at Tableau, you're building the product, you're thinking about other things, but you're not necessarily thinking about how actual people are using it all the time. So I encountered an issue, and I'll tell you about that. So one of the things is as a manager connectivity, so one of the things that my team does is we're building this new thing called the Tableau Connector SDK. It's basically a way to build new connectors, put them into Tableau. Software Development Kit is what SDK stands for. And Sid over there is responsible from the PM side for this effort. And I was kind of thinking about this. So I hadn't really been directly involved with the development of this, right? Even though it's my team, I wasn't involved with all the ins and outs of what was possible with it. And so I wanted to sort of see, okay, well, what would happen if I built a new connector using this SDK? What would be the experience of coming in from the outside and trying to use kind of some of the more advanced features of Tableau? And so I decided to build a plugin for Airtable to connect to my little Rose database. Went ahead and built a JDBC driver and a plugin, but I created a few rules for myself. I had to build this thing as if I didn't work at Tableau. So I had to kind of put this artificial firewall between myself and my own team. I couldn't cheat, I couldn't look at the source code. It's really easy to look at the source code if you work at Tableau and figure out what's going on. But in this case, I wanted to say, listen, I don't want to do that. I really want to put this in place. I want to see what customers are seeing when they're building their plugins. And I couldn't ask for help at work, right? I sit near these people. So created the plugin, put it on GitHub, cruising along, everything's going great, but then ran into a problem. So the details here are not necessarily important, but one of the things that the SDK did not support in April was this thing called an extract-only connector, basically being able to download all the data at once and shove it into Tableau, the way this particular framework worked. So I went ahead and I filed a GitHub issue. And I said, you know what? I'm writing a plugin for a JDBC driver that has no chance of being SQL 92 compliant. I'd like to see an example of an extract-only plugin. How does this work? I kind of knew they existed, because I guess that's sort of a form of cheating, but I wanted to see how it would work. So Sid, this guy right here in the back, he marked it as an enhancement. Thanks, Sid. And Logan, who works on my team, responded, tracked internally 936.118. Thanks, Logan. I'm not on the network right now. I'm building this plugin at home. Logan, what does 936.118 mean? Nobody knows. But Logan knows, and I will show you what 936.118 means. It means this. So it's just a reference to an internal tracking system. We use TFS at Tableau for tracking a lot of work. And so 936.118 came in there. Logan filed it, which is great. You know, it included sort of a reference to the GitHub issue and a little bit of detail and things like that. And this is fantastic. And then it was closed actually as a duplicate of this other issue that doesn't mention my roses at all, right? It doesn't mention my roses, doesn't mention anything, but it's fine. It's a duplicate issue. One of the things is, so we've taken sort of some of that passion, some of that idea or the why of what I needed personally, and we've made it a bit more generic, right, as sort of something that might be more applicable to a bunch of other customers in this other larger TFS item there. So that's kind of an interesting difference. And then later on, you know, I was getting close to TC. I'm getting worried, right? My plugin isn't working. Nothing's going right. So I go ahead and I email the PM team from my personal account. Said, good sir and or madam, I have continued my efforts these past few days to develop my Airtable plugin using a secretly leaked copy of Tableau 2019-3. My plugin is available here. My main issues are that the sign-in button is no longer enabled no matter what I do. I cannot remove the server field, and there's no clear way of creating an extract-only plugin, which was my original issue. I am at an impasse, and I have considered using my connections at Tableau to retrieve the secret knowledge I need to be successful, but I would rather not do that. Please help. All right. Logan goes ahead and responds with, Dear Mr. Q, thank you for your recent note regarding your experiences with the Tableau Connector SDK. I am deeply troubled by the issues you have encountered and am endeavoring to answer each question in a timely manner on our GitHub page. Some of these items will take further work from my excellent team of engineers who, even as I write, are hard at work in the very depths of the monolith, improving the way for further work, which will address your server field and hybrid dialect issues. I do not see any GitHub issues for your extract-only and disabled sign-in button inquiries, but if you would kindly open 2 of them, it would give us a public place to record the resolution, which will doubtless help many other customers. Thank you, and you will be hearing from us again soon. Now, Logan obviously knows this is me, right? And this is fine. That's not the point, but there's sort of a lot of, that's how some of this communication between customers and Tableau goes, right? We take some of these issues and it becomes like a little bit inhuman, right? We're not necessarily, I don't see any sort of transmission of importance, that sort of thing. And so like the key thing here is that like, this is sort of a made up example, but there's more to it, and there's sort of a broader question. If you go back to sort of the question that was asked last night, which was about sort of what makes Tableau special, right? The passion and sort of the interest in being able to explore data and feeling empowered to do data, that sometimes hits a brick wall when we're actually working through these issues, right? Tableau is not perfect. And we look at problems through a microscope. As I filed this issue, it turned into a different issue. It turned into something more specific. It wasn't, I know that when that issue was worked on, they weren't, they were thinking about this sort of in a narrow context. And maybe they met my requirements, maybe they didn't, maybe something got lost. I don't know. And sort of that lack of context around the problem that the customer's solving, it inhibits empathy, right? It keeps us from necessarily building the right product. And this is a real challenge because we also have to build a product that serves a lot of customers. We can't necessarily have the stories of every customer in order to work through it and internalize all of that. We have to think about kind of this general viewpoint, but are we losing something by thinking about it in a general way? And is there a way to sort of help mitigate that? Is there a way to kind of help communicate that sense of empathy, that sense of empowerment that folks here feel when they're working with Tableau personally? So, I mean, there's a few things. I have a couple things here that certainly engineering, it's kind of an interesting talk because I'm talking to customers, but it's also kind of a talk for the engineering team in a lot of ways. And support and some other things. It's like, what are you working on? What problem are you trying to solve? Just simple questions, just getting a little bit more context from everyone we talk to, understanding what's going on, why is it important? It helps kind of unlock a lot of sort of the frustration, or helps us understand some of the frustration when there's something that's gone wrong. And once you understand it, it helps quite a bit. There's some other things is, internal hackathons. We do this about every 6 months or so. And one of the things you sort of notice is sort of defects that are filed kind of internally, and they kind of go through different waves of the release. So there's a little bit of noise here in a lot of ways. But one of the things I've noticed is that when we do an internal hackathon, essentially what happens is the entire engineering team sort of goes off and they start exploring the product. They start working on other things that are a little bit unusual, that are expanding the boundary. And one of the fun things about this that I don't think is entirely well understood is that defects increase during the hackathon because we're using the product in ways that we wouldn't normally do if we were sort of looking at a narrow issue or a narrow feature. And so that's something that I think we could probably improve upon. And then the other thing is that just even at that Tableau conference, whether you're talking to somebody from Tableau, from support, or whoever, just giving that extra data, don't assume that we don't care about roses, right? We may not know anything about roses, right? We may not know anything about whatever you're using Tableau for, but providing just a little bit of context to sort of set the stage and give us kind of a better understanding of this, it definitely helps bridge that gap. And you see that in the cases where we've seen kind of issues kind of come through support and things like that and turn into that sort of really kind of boring TFS bug ticket thing that I showed earlier. It's you even see some of the context from that because we're communicating with the person who got that context over that full chain. So make sure to share your use case, share why it's important. It makes all the difference. But I do want to kind of open it up. This is kind of like it's kind of one of these interesting things where I've been thinking about some of these issues of quality and how we incorporate this. But just open it up to any questions from you guys. It can be about roses, it can be about quality, it can be about sort of frustrations with the Tableau product, that sort of thing. So.
Did you get your enhancement?
My enhancement? I did. Yeah, thanks to Sid. Yeah, no, I did get it, and there's a few other things that were kind of quite clear. Like one of the things that became clear as we're kind of going through it is like there's a lot of other use cases for that type of connector that weren't necessarily well understood. So, go for it.
How long is your pollen viable, and if so, how do you store it? Do you store it in the refrigerator?
Now you want to, so we dry it out, we leave it kind of open air, we don't want it to develop mold, probably a couple days at most. I've heard of it being saved quite a bit longer, we haven't done that. We do keep it around for a while, like we don't necessarily throw it out, but we usually try to use it within a few days.
So
Yeah.
The votes are up to over 1,000.
Yeah.
It's been years and it still isn't.
Yeah.
Isn't there something at least say, yeah, we're looking at it, or we're never going to do this, don't bother voting anymore?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that's a good question. We do have people who go through the forum links and look at those sorts of things. One of the problems with the community, with the ideas voting, is that we don't have a clear way to necessarily associate that with each feature request, and things get lost in the noise. The team at Tableau, I kind of had a little bit of frustration with this, but we have rolled out kind of a new system to track all of the features and incorporate some of that community forum data a little bit better. Even that TFS item, there's another object where you're supposed to put in a idea forum link as well. One of the curious things about Tableau, and this kind of goes back to when I started, so I've been working there for about 4 years, and when I joined the company, I came from another type of analytics company, and I was in the interview process, and I'm talking to a bunch of people, and I'm saying, okay, so what's sort of like the rate at which you look at KPIs, and how do you look at these, what interval, because those used to, every 2 weeks, we'd look at KPIs, we'd sort of adjust the strategy, we'd do different things like that. And it was funny because at that time, this was 2015, some of the Tableau folks, they looked at me and said, we don't do that. One of the curious things about Tableau is that internally, we haven't necessarily adopted data for our own decision making in the most effective way. Right, and that has been kind of a significant drawback. So categorizing like the idea forums links, right, or even just making sure that when there's a support case that comes in, making sure that that's aligned to different feature teams, and we kind of have, or I don't want to use the internal terminology, but that it's better categorized is kind of like this long process. We actually go through a lot of the same process that a lot of other companies do, where we just have challenges making sense of our existing data. And so that's a frustrating thing. I agree. There are kind of motions in place. It's not all there yet. Anybody else?
Your roses naturalized?
Naturalized? What do you mean by?
Like they're able to survive on their own without human interaction.
Yeah, so we use a lot of species roses, and we use some Pacific Northwest roses as well. And none of the roses that we are breeding we don't use any fertilizer or nothing like that. There's some hybridizers that will actually intentionally sort of spread black spot, this fungal disease across different roses as they're in the breeding program to make sure that the die-off rate is consistently high and they get disease-resistant roses. So some of them can survive. We don't, in terms of, are you concerned about invasive species? Yeah, and that is a real concern, and it's a concern in the Pacific Northwest as well. If you look in Seattle, it's a large number of invasive species throughout that region. But if you look at the Olympic Peninsula, you have a lot of native roses and things like that. It is a concern. It is definitely a concern. I mean, I don't expect roses, compared to other types of invasive species, to spread as rapidly, to be as much of a concern, but that is something unique to the program. So, any other questions? Yeah.
What's the most unexpected result you had of reference data analyzing?
I think one of the interesting things, so originally in our program, we really wanted to cross with this one rose called a Sally Holmes which is beautiful rose. It's vigorous and it produces these wonderful hips, and it's just a fantastic. It looked on the surface like a fantastic candidate, and one of the interesting things is that like we just have, like, despite many attempts at sort of covering the full surface space throughout our program with other types of roses of different genetic types, we've not been able to cross with it. And so there's a lot of these things where sort of we expected, given sort of like visual indicators of what this rose could do, that just it was not happening despite sort of our best efforts. And so there's a few really good examples like that. And there's some other, like, there's just a lot of unexpected roses. Sometimes we get successes too. Like, I personally really love Midnight Blue, which is one of the first roses we showed up there. And I was extremely pleased when it, became one of these roses that was pretty useful in a breeding program. It was really quite nice. And yeah, that's about it. I think there's a lot of other little examples. It's just from our data specifically, that's kind of where we're at. We're not doing short sequence reads or anything like that on our own roses. We probably should. It'd be nice to do that, but that can be costly and time consuming. But yeah. Other questions? Yeah. You are, but there's lots of rules. So you can't propagate you can't like make cuttings of a patented rose, but you can cross with them, and you have to have that full history and the full genetic history. So there's a legal reason to kind of keep a lot of the data as well, but there's no restrictions on that. But you do need to kind of like keep track of that stuff and make sure that it's above board. Yeah. We're not at the point right now where we need a patent attorney, but if we did that, basically, then we would, if we actually did it commercially, we'd go through that whole process. And we'd use all this data to basically sort of look through the iterations and validate that we're doing the right thing. So. Any other questions?
Have you tried changing wind limiters?
We don't have greenhouse space. That's actually sort of the biggest challenge. We do have a small greenhouse. We could do it in some isolation. We might be able to change some of the other environmental factors, but we have not tried changing that. Like if we were really doing that, we would actually get like a much larger greenhouse, and we would set them at different temperatures. And in the winter, when we're germinating them, we will, we have it temperature controlled for the stratification process, but we're not ready to do that for the full breeding program. We can only do that at the size of little potential seedlings right now.
Plans for like neural imaging sensors or anything like that for your tracking your plant growth?
I have thought about that, yeah. There's a couple of interesting things. So it's not really, one of the things that we're interested in is the first germination date. Sometimes you can lose it because you don't necessarily see it, especially if you're doing it at, Seattle winters are dark. You go out there with a flashlight, you're kind of looking around for anything that pops up. I think that we could potentially have like a webcam that actually looks at that stuff and detects it. One of the things that's sort of challenging there, I think it's possible. I think one of the challenges right now is that we don't have our initial germination mixture has sort of a lot of other aggregate. It's not a consistent color. So there's some challenges there. Thought about it, haven't done it yet. I think I'd rather get like all of the roses in our program kind of tested with there's certain genetic markers that you can look for different classifications, and then start working through the genetics of that as well. So. Any other? All right. Well, you can come talk to me after the talk if you have any other questions about anything. Let me know. All right.